I am Roland, 28, an architectural designer living in Boston. My relationship with my family has always been close but complicated, like a blueprint with hidden structural flaws. Last weekend at my father's birthday dinner, my parents laughed and said my sister would be staying at my house for a while. The problem: I had not lived in my apartment for 6 weeks. Their obliviousness hit me like a collapsing beam. Before I tell you how I discovered my own family forgot I existed, let me know where you are watching from in the comments and subscribe if you want to hear more stories about family dynamics that will make your jaw drop. Growing up in suburban Chicago, our middle-class family seemed picture-perfect from the outside. My father, Thomas, worked as a financial advisor, putting in 60-hour weeks to provide for us. My mother, Diana, taught 4th grade at the local elementary school, always bringing home stacks of papers to grade after dinner. Then there was my younger sister, Allison, 3 years my junior at 25, who seemed to capture the spotlight from the moment she took her first steps. Our house was modest, but comfortable, with 4 bedrooms and a backyard where Dad would occasionally grill on summer weekends when he was not too exhausted from work. The walls of our living room told the story of our family values through carefully arranged photographs and awards. Allison's dance competition trophies dominated the main shelf, alongside framed certificates of her academic achievements. My architectural sketches and design awards were tucked into the corner bookshelf, visible only if you knew where to look. The pattern established itself early. When I brought home straight, as my parents would nod approvingly, saying, "That is what we expect from you, Roland." When Allison did the same, there would be celebratory dinners and phone calls to grandparents, announcing her accomplishments. I noticed this discrepancy by age 10, but convinced myself it was normal that perhaps all older siblings lived in the shadow of the younger ones. Despite the imbalance, I maintained a close relationship with my parents throughout elementary and middle school. I was a quiet, dedicated student who loved to draw and build elaborate structures with whatever materials I could find. My father occasionally showed interest in my architectural sketches, sometimes offering suggestions about more practical career paths. Architecture is competitive, son. Have you considered accounting? Everyone needs an accountant. High school brought both distance and determination. I threw myself into advanced placement courses and architectural design competitions, winning state recognition that earned me a partial scholarship to Cornell University. The day my acceptance letter arrived, I rushed home bursting with excitement. My parents were in the kitchen, hovering over a form Allison had brought home about cheerleading camp. I got into Cornell. With a scholarship, I announced, waving the letter. "That is nice, honey," my mother said, glancing up briefly. "We will talk about it later. Allison needs to get this form signed by today." Later never really came. My acceptance became a footnote in family conversations, mentioned primarily in relation to costs and logistics. Meanwhile, Allison's decision about which cheerleading camp to attend warranted a full family discussion over dinner. I left for Cornell with my father's awkward handshake and my mother's distracted hug, already feeling the physical distance mirroring the emotional one that had been growing for years. Still, I called home weekly, sharing details about my classes, my professors, and the projects that ignited my passion. These calls grew increasingly one-sided, with my news receiving brief acknowledgments before the conversation inevitably turned to Allison's latest drama or achievement. Despite this, I excelled academically and socially at Cornell. I found friends who shared my passion for innovative design, professors who mentored me, and gradually built a life where my accomplishments were recognized and celebrated. By junior year, my design for a sustainable urban community center had won a prestigious regional competition, putting me on the radar of several architectural firms. My relationship with Allison during these years was complicated. As children, we had been close, building blanket forts and creating imaginary worlds together. But as the pattern of parental favoritism became more pronounced, a wedge formed between us. It was not her fault that our parents centered their world around her, but her acceptance of this imbalance as normal made it difficult to maintain our connection. Our conversations during college became superficial, punctuated by long silences and growing resentment that neither of us knew how to address. Senior year brought job offers, including one from an innovative firm in Boston, known for their sustainable urban development projects. When I called my parents to share the news, my father asked about the starting salary, then immediately compared it to what his friend's son made as a new financial analyst. "It is decent for architecture," he said, "though you would have made more if you had gone into finance." My mother's response was to ask if I would be home for Allison's college graduation the following month. No congratulations. No pride. Just logistics about another event centered around my sister. I accepted the Boston position, moved into a small but stylish apartment in the South End, and began building the life I had always envisioned. I was determined to create success on my own terms, with or without my family's recognition. Still like a moth drawn to a painful flame, I continued making those weekly calls home, hoping that someday they would see me, really see me, and the man I had become. My career in Boston flourished from the start. The firm recognized my innovative approaches to urban sustainability, and within 18 months, I was leading small projects with my own team. Each success felt validating proof that my passion and talent were real, despite my family's indifference. I decorated my apartment with carefully selected furniture that reflected my aesthetic sensibilities, creating the home I had always wanted, a space where every object had meaning and purpose. During my second year in Boston, I developed a revolutionary design for converting abandoned industrial spaces into affordable housing with integrated green spaces. The project won a regional sustainability award, and my firm threw a celebration party. That night, flushed with pride, and perhaps too many glasses of champagne, I called my parents thinking, surely this achievement would finally register. "That sounds nice," Roland, my father, said after my breathless explanation. "Listen, we are dealing with a situation with Allison right now. She lost her apartment because her roommate moved out unexpectedly. She is moving back home temporarily while she figures things out." This was the first of what would become Allison's pattern of temporary moves back to our parents' house. Her post-college years were marked by a series of false starts. Jobs quit after a few months because they were not fulfilling apartments she could not afford, on her own relationships that ended dramatically. Each crisis became the family's central focus, with my parents rearranging their lives to accommodate her needs. Meanwhile, my calls home became increasingly frustrating exercises. I would share news about a promotion or an exciting project, only to have the conversation redirected to Allison's latest drama within minutes. I began to feel like a background character in my own family story. My narrative thread picked up and dropped without consequence to the main plot. I am designing a community center that will be featured in Architectural Digest, I shared during one call. "That is nice, honey," my mother replied. "Did I tell you Allison is thinking about going back to school for her master's degree? We are so excited." The pattern became so predictable that I started timing how long it took for them to change the subject to Allison after I shared personal news. The record was 12 seconds. Last Thanksgiving marked a turning point. I flew home for the holiday, bringing an expensive bottle of wine and excitement about a potential promotion to senior designer. The position would mean greater creative control and a significant salary increase, achievements I thought might finally register with my parents as legitimate success. The conversation at dinner went something like this: "I have been put up for senior designer," I said during a rare lull in the conversation about Allison's latest job interview. "They will decide next month, but my boss says it looks promising." My father nodded vaguely. "That is good. Pass the gravy, would you?" My mother smiled distractedly. "Senior designer. Is that like a management position?" Before I could answer, Allison jumped in. "I had the worst experience with the human resources person at my interview yesterday. You would not believe what she asked me. And just like that, my news evaporated like morning mist, leaving no trace. My parents leaned forward, fully engaged in Allison's story about an inappropriate interview question, while my promotion hung in the air unacknowledged. That night, lying in my childhood bedroom, surrounded by remnants of a past self, I confronted a painful realization. I might be invisible in my own family. Not metaphorically or occasionally overlooked, but fundamentally unseen as a person with my own life and struggles. The thought was both devastating and oddly liberating, like finally naming a disease that had been causing mysterious symptoms for years. 2 weeks after returning to Boston, disaster struck. A major pipe burst in the apartment above mine, sending water cascading through my ceiling at 3 in the morning. I woke to the sound of dripping, switched on the light, and found myself in a nightmare. Water poured through light fixtures and ceiling seams, soaking my furniture, ruining my laptop, and destroying the detailed models I had built for an upcoming presentation. I called my parents in a panic the next day, after spending the night in a 24-hour diner because I had nowhere else to go. "The apartment is destroyed," I explained, my voice shaking with exhaustion and stress. "The building manager says it will take at least 6 weeks to repair everything. I need to find somewhere to stay, and I have this huge presentation coming up, and all my materials are ruined." "That is terrible, honey," my mother said, sounding genuinely concerned for the first moment. "Listen, I need to take this other call. It is about Allison's car trouble. Can I call you back?" She never did. 3 days later, I called again, having secured temporary housing with my colleague Jack, who had a spare room. "I found a place to stay," I explained. "I am with my coworker Jack until the apartment is fixed." "Who is Jack?" my mother asked. "My colleague. I mentioned him before. He is letting me stay in his guest room while my apartment is repaired." "Oh, that is nice of him," she said. "Listen, your father and I are thinking about helping Allison with a down payment on a condo. What do you think? Is it a good time to buy?" The conversation shifted completely, as if my housing crisis was resolved and therefore no longer of interest. I answered their questions about the real estate market automatically, while a numbness spread through me. It was the last time I tried to share anything meaningful about my personal struggles with them. The apartment disaster was even worse than I initially realized. Once the emergency response team had stopped the immediate flooding, the true extent of the damage became clear. The water had penetrated deep into the walls and flooring, creating ideal conditions for mold growth. The building inspector deemed the entire unit uninhabitable until a complete remediation and renovation could be completed. "Minimum 6 weeks," the property manager explained, looking genuinely apologetic. "Could be 8, depending on contractor availability. Insurance should cover a portion of your temporary housing costs." I stood in my apartment the next day, wearing a mask, as recommended, salvaging what I could. The beautiful mid-century modern couch I had splurged on was ruined. My carefully curated book collection on architectural theory and design was largely destroyed. Worst of all, the detailed physical models I had created for an upcoming client presentation were warped beyond repair. Jack's offer of his spare room was a lifeline. We had become friends over the past 2 years, bonding over our shared aesthetic sensibilities and dry sense of humor. His apartment in Cambridge was modern and minimalist, with large windows that flooded the space with natural light. The guest room was small but private, with a desk where I could work. "Stay as long as you need," Jack said, helping me bring in the few bags of salvageable possessions. "Seriously, no rush." The first week was consumed with practicalities, filing insurance claims, finding storage for items that survived, but had nowhere to go, reconstructing my work materials and searching for rental apartments in case the repairs took longer than estimated. Each night I collapsed into the unfamiliar bed, exhaustion washing over me in waves. I called my parents 3 times that week, each conversation brief and unsatisfying. During the third call, I realized with a jolt that they had completely forgotten about my housing situation. "How is the weather in Boston?" my mother asked casually. "Cold and rainy," I replied, making it even more difficult to go back and forth to the storage unit. "Storage unit? What do you mean?" I paused, disbelief washing over me. "For my things. From my apartment. The one with severe water damage." "Oh, right. That, is it fixed yet?" "Mom, I told you it would take at least 6 weeks. It has been 8 days. "Well, no need to get snippy, Roland. I cannot keep track of everything going on with everyone." The next few weeks fell into a strange rhythm. During the day, I threw myself into work, staying late at the office to compensate for the materials and resources I no longer had access to at home. My colleagues were supportive, but I kept the full extent of my situation private, embarrassed by the growing emptiness I felt. In the evenings, Jack and I would sometimes cook together or watch design documentaries, his friendship becoming an unexpected comfort during this period of displacement. On weekends, I toured potential apartments, preparing for the possibility that my original unit might not be salvageable. Throughout this time, the complete absence of any genuine interest from my family became increasingly apparent and painful. I continued making weekly calls out of habit and some stubborn hope for connection. Each conversation followed the same pattern: brief inquiries about my work, followed by extensive updates about Allison's latest job prospect or dating drama. Not once did either of my parents ask where I was staying, how I was managing without my possessions, or whether I needed any help. It was as if the crisis had never happened or had been resolved instantly. Their complete disconnect from the reality of my life was startling. 4 weeks into my displacement, during yet another call filled with news about Allison's considerations of graduate school programs, a realization crystallized. I had become a periodic checkmark on my parents' mental list of parental duties. Call Roland. Check. Listen for 30 seconds. Check. Return to real concerns about Allison. Check. That night, I found myself researching therapists, something I had considered for years but never pursued. 2 days later, I sat in Dr. Karen Miller's office, a warm space with muted colors and comfortable seating. "I think my family has forgotten I exist." I said the words sounding bizarre, even as they left my mouth, not in a dramatic, disowned way. They just do not seem to register my life as real or important. Over the next 2 sessions, Dr. Miller helped me explore the patterns in my family dynamics, introducing concepts like emotional neglect and invisible child syndrome. She did not offer easy answers or villainize my parents, but she validated my experience in a way no one ever had before. "What you are describing is a real phenomenon," she explained. "Sometimes family systems develop in ways that place certain members in supporting roles rather than main characters. It does not mean your parents do not love you, but it does mean your emotional needs have not been met adequately." While I grappled with these insights, I also began strengthening connections with friends who had shown genuine interest in my well-being. Jack, of course, who had opened his home without hesitation. Sarah from the office, who had checked in regularly and brought me a houseplant to make the temporary space feel more like home. Miguel from my weekly soccer game, who had offered his couch if I ever needed a change of scenery. These people, I realized, saw me more clearly after knowing me for a relatively short time than my family did after 28 years. The recognition was both painful and eye-opening. As the 6th week of my displacement approached, my father's 60th birthday loomed on the calendar. Despite my growing awareness of the imbalance in our relationship, I decided to make the trip home for the celebration. Part of me still hoped for recognition, for some moment of connection that would bridge the widening gap between us. Another part simply felt obligated, trained by years of family expectations to show up regardless of how I was treated in return. I booked a weekend flight to Chicago, packed a small bag, and prepared myself emotionally for what would inevitably be the Allison show featuring my father's birthday as a subplot. What I could not have prepared for was how completely the reality of my life had vanished from my family's consciousness. The flight to Chicago was turbulent both literally and as a metaphor for my emotional state. I had spent the morning with Dr. Miller working through strategies for maintaining boundaries during the weekend visit. Remember, she had said, "You cannot control how they respond to you, only how you respond to them." I had nodded, repeating the mantra silently as the plane bounced through rough air. By the time we landed, I had constructed what I thought was a solid emotional fortress, complete with predetermined exit strategies for particularly difficult moments. I would be present for my father's birthday, maintain pleasant but superficial conversation, and return to Boston with my dignity intact. The first cracks in my fortress appeared almost immediately. My parents had forgotten to tell me what time to arrive, so when I texted from the airport, there was a scramble to figure out who could pick me up. "We thought you were coming tomorrow," my mother said over the phone, her voice betraying mild annoyance at the inconvenience. "Your father is at the golf course with his friends, and I am getting my hair done for the party. Can you take a taxi?" I swallowed my disappointment and caught an overpriced airport cab, watching the familiar suburban landscape pass by through the window. The driver, sensing my mood, mercifully remained silent for the 40-minute ride. When I arrived at the house, the front door was locked. I rang the doorbell twice before remembering the spare key hidden in a fake rock by the garage, wondering if this was some kind of cosmic joke at my expense. Inside the house smelled like lemon furniture polish and the cinnamon candles my mother favored. Everything looked exactly as it always had. Yet I felt like a stranger, trespassing in someone else's memory. I took my bag to my old bedroom, which had been partially converted into a home office, but still contained my twin bed and some high school memorabilia. On the desk sat a framed photograph of Allison's college graduation, my parents beaming proudly on either side of her. I searched the room but could find no photographs that included me. My mother arrived an hour later carrying shopping bags and expressing surprise to find me sitting in the living room. "Roland, you startled me. I forgot you had arrived already." She gave me a quick perfunctory hug before bustling into the kitchen with her purchases. I followed, offering to help with dinner preparations for my father's birthday meal that evening. As we worked side by side chopping vegetables and marinating steaks, my mother chatted continuously about Allison's job. Search her recent breakup with a very nice boy, with excellent prospects, and her consideration of graduate programs in psychology. "She is thinking about moving back home while she applies to schools," my mother said, arranging potatoes in a baking dish. "Your father thinks it is a wonderful idea. She has always brought such life to the house." I nodded, focusing intently on the carrots I was slicing. "How long would she stay?" "Oh, however long she needs. That is what family is for, right? To be there during transitions." I thought about my 6 weeks of displacement, the complete absence of any such offer from my parents, and felt something hard and cold form in my chest. My father arrived home just before 5, greeting me with a distracted handshake, and immediately launching into a story about his golf game. Within minutes, he was showing me videos of his improved swing on his phone, never once asking about my job, my apartment, or my life in Boston. Allison arrived last, making her entrance with her characteristic blend of chaos and charm. She hugged our parents effusively, presented my father with an expensive-looking watch from that brand you love, and gave me a quick side hug with a whispered, "Hey, stranger." Throughout the birthday dinner, I tried repeatedly to engage in meaningful conversation, asking my father about his retirement plans, commenting on local news stories I had researched. Specifically for the visit, even bringing up shared memories from family vacations. Each attempt was met with polite but brief responses before the conversation inevitably circled back to Allison, who dominated the table with animated stories about her adventures and challenges. I observed my family with growing detachment, noting how they leaned toward Allison when she spoke, how their eyes lit up at her jokes, how they anticipated her needs before she expressed them. In contrast, I had to repeat myself twice when I asked for the salt, and no one noticed when I quietly refilled my wine glass for the third time. The breaking point came during dessert. My mother had made my father's favorite cheesecake. And as we gathered around the dining table, the conversation turned to living arrangements. "Allison, have you started looking at graduate programs yet?" my father asked, savoring a large bite of cheesecake. "I have been researching schools in Boston, actually," she replied. "The programs there are really strong." My mother clapped her hands together. "Boston? You could be near Roland. Would that not be wonderful?" My father chuckled, reaching for his coffee mug. Maybe she could stay with Roland while she visits schools. That fancy apartment of his must have a guest room, right? They both laughed, as if the idea of siblings helping each other was somehow novel and amusing. Allison looked uncomfortable, glancing at me with an expression I could not quite read. "That would be perfect." My mother continued, warming to the idea. "Allison will only be staying at your house for a while, just until she gets a feel for the city." Something inside me snapped. 6 weeks of displacement, of struggling alone, of calling home to ears that did not listen, culminated in this moment of complete obliviousness. I stood up my chair, scraping loudly against the hardwood floor. "How funny," I said, my voice steady, despite the earthquake happening inside me. "I have not lived in my apartment for 6 weeks. The table fell silent. My mother's fork paused midway to her mouth. "What do you mean?" she asked, her brow furrowed in confusion. "My apartment. The one you think Allison can stay in. I have not lived there in 6 weeks because a pipe burst and flooded everything I own. I told you this. Multiple times." My father shifted in his seat, discomfort evident in his posture. "You mentioned some plumbing problem, I think. Is it still not fixed?" It was not a plumbing problem. It was a disaster. Everything I owned was destroyed. My furniture, my books, my work materials, everything. My mother's voice shook slightly as she asked the question that would forever mark a before and after in our relationship. "Wait. So, where exactly have you been staying?" The genuine confusion in her face broke something fundamental in my understanding of family. They truly did not know. The information had entered their ears and evaporated, leaving no trace, as if my life was so insubstantial it could not even form a memory. "I have been staying with my colleague Jack," I said, my voice rising. Despite my efforts to control it, "I told you this. I called you the day it happened. I called you multiple times over the past 6 weeks, but you never asked. Not once did either of you ask how I was doing, if I needed help, if I had a place to sleep." My father straightened, defensive now. "Roland, you are a grown man. You have always been so independent. We assumed you had it handled. Independent." I laughed, the sound harsh, even to my own ears. "I am not independent by choice. I learned to be self-sufficient because I had to. Because there was never room for my needs in this family." "That is not fair," my mother protested, tears forming in her eyes. "We have always supported you." "Supported me how?" "By forgetting major events in my life, by changing the subject whenever I try to share anything important, by never, not once, coming to visit me in Boston in 3 years. I turned to Allison, whose face had gone pale. "This is not about you. I do not blame you for being their favorite. But do you realize they have an entire section of the living room dedicated to your accomplishments, while my architectural award, the one that was featured in national publications, is sitting in a drawer somewhere?" My father stood now, his face flushing with anger. "That is enough, Roland. You are acting like a child. If you were having problems, you should have been more clear about needing help. Something inside me went very still and quiet. I was clear. You just were not listening. You have never listened. I am not even real to you, am I? I am just an occasional phone call to check off your parental duty list. My mother was openly crying now. How can you say such horrible things? We love you. Love requires attention, I said, suddenly exhausted. It requires seeing the other person as they really are, not as a vague concept. When was the last time either of you asked me a question about my life and actually listened to the answer? The silence that followed was deafening. I need some air, I said, finally walking out of the dining room and through the front door into the cool evening. Behind me, I could hear my mother's sobs and my father's attempts to comfort her. Part of me wanted to go back to apologize for the outburst, to smooth things over, as I had done countless times before. But a stronger part, the part that had been silenced for too long, kept walking toward the park at the end of the street. I sat on a bench in the gathering darkness, my hands shaking as the adrenaline wore off. For the first time in my adult life, I had spoken my truth to my family, had refused to accept the role assigned to me in their narrative. The liberation and grief of that moment were equally overwhelming. I did not return to the house that night. Instead, I checked into a hotel near the airport, sending a brief text to my mother that I was safe but needed space. The reply came almost instantly. Please come home. We need to talk. I turned my phone off and fell into a dreamless sleep, emotionally exhausted beyond words. Morning brought clarity and a strange sense of calm. I ordered room service breakfast and sat by the window watching planes take off and land in the distance. Each one represented people moving toward or away from someone or something, connections forming and breaking across vast distances. I wondered how many of those travelers felt truly seen by the people they were flying toward. My phone, once powered back on, revealed multiple missed calls and messages from both parents, and surprisingly one from Allison. Hers was the only one I opened. I had no idea. I am so sorry. Can we talk before you leave? We met at a coffee shop halfway between the hotel and our parents' house. Allison arrived, first securing a quiet table in the corner. When I walked in, she stood awkwardly, as if unsure whether to hug me. I made the decision for her, giving her a brief embrace before sitting down. I ordered you a black coffee, she said, pushing a mug toward me. You still take it black, right? The fact that she remembered such a small detail about me felt significant somehow. Thanks. Yes, I do. She fidgeted with her own cup, adding a third packet of sugar. Some things never changed. Roland, I do not know where to start. Last night was intense. That is putting it mildly, I agreed, taking a sip of coffee. I did not plan to explode like that. Maybe you should have exploded years ago. Her direct gaze surprised me. What you said about being invisible in the family. I always sensed something was off, but I never really understood until last night. What do you mean you sensed something was off? She sighed, pushing her hair behind her ears in a gesture so familiar it made my chest ache with unexpected affection. The way they treated us differently, the way your achievements were acknowledged and then immediately forgotten while mine were celebrated endlessly. I noticed, Roland. I just did not know what to do about it. You were a kid, I said. It was not your responsibility to fix their parenting. But I participated in it, did not I? I accepted being the center of attention. I talked over you at family gatherings. I let them make everything about me. I considered this stirring my coffee unnecessarily. Maybe. But there was a system in place long before you were old enough to recognize it. Mom and Dad created the dynamic not you." Allison nodded, her eyes suspiciously bright. "After you left last night, they were in shock. Dad kept saying he had no idea you felt that way. Mom cried for hours, going through old photo albums, pointing out pictures of you, as if trying to prove to herself that she had paid attention to you." "And what do you think?" I asked, genuinely curious about her perspective. "I think." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "I think they love you in their way, but they do not know you as a person. And I think I do not know you either. Not really. That is on me as much as them." Her honesty was refreshing after years of surface-level interactions. We talked for nearly 3 hours, covering ground that should have been explored years ago. Allison shared her own struggles with our parents' expectations, the pressure of being the favorite, creating its own burden of perfection. I told her about my life in Boston, not just the professional accomplishments that could be quantified and bragged about, but the small joys and challenges that made up my daily existence. When we finally parted, something had shifted between us. Not a complete healing, but a crack in the wall that had separated us for years, allowing a thin stream of light to penetrate. "Will you talk to Mom and Dad before you leave?" she asked as we stood outside the coffee shop. "I do not know," I admitted. "I'm not sure I have the emotional energy for that conversation right now. They are devastated, Roland. Confused, defensive at times, but mostly just sad. I think they are realizing how much they have missed." I promised to consider it and headed back to the hotel, where I called Dr. Miller for an emergency phone session. "What you experienced was a breakthrough moment," she said, after I recounted the previous night's events. "Painful but potentially transformative. The question now is, what boundaries do you want to establish moving forward?" It was a question that occupied my thoughts for the rest of the day. What did I want from my family? Was it possible to build a healthier relationship, or was the damage too extensive? Did I have the courage to demand the respect and attention I deserved, even if it meant risking rejection? By evening, I had made 2 decisions. First, I would not see my parents before returning to Boston. The wounds were too fresh, the emotions too raw for a productive conversation. Second, I would accept the promotion I had been hesitant about because it required relocation to Seattle. The opportunity was excellent professionally, but I had been reluctant to move even farther from my family. Now that distance seemed like exactly what I needed. I called my boss that night and accepted the position, feeling a weight lift as I committed to prioritizing my career and personal growth. The 6-hour flight to Seattle would make casual visits home nearly impossible, creating a natural boundary that would require intentional effort to overcome. If my family wanted a relationship with me, they would need to demonstrate it through more than obligatory holiday invitations. The next morning, I flew back to Boston, to Jack's spare room that had become more home to me than my childhood house had felt in years. He greeted me with his usual understated warmth, asking about the trip but not pushing when I gave only vague answers. "Want to watch that documentary about Japanese minimalist architecture?" he offered, instead his way of providing companionship without demands. As we sat in his living room, the familiar patterns of light from passing cars moving across the ceiling, I felt a surge of gratitude for the chosen family I had built. Friends who noticed when I was quiet, who remembered my coffee order, who offered shelter without expectation of performance. These connections, I realized, were teaching me what it meant to be truly seen. 3 days after returning to Boston, I received an email from my father. The formal medium was unusual for him and signaled the gravity with which he viewed our situation. The message was brief. "Your mother and I would like to visit you in Boston next weekend, if that is acceptable. We feel we have much to discuss and would prefer to do so in person rather than over the phone. Please let us know if this would be possible." My immediate instinct was to refuse to protect the fragile sense of equilibrium I had established since my return. But Dr. Miller's voice echoed in my mind. Avoidance may feel safer, but it rarely leads to resolution. After consulting with her in our regular session, I replied with a cautious acceptance, suggesting we meet at a neutral location rather than in either of our personal spaces. I spent the intervening days preparing mentally for the encounter, working with Dr. Miller to develop clear boundaries and communication strategies. Remember, she advised, you are not responsible for their emotional reactions to your truth. Your only obligation is to express yourself honestly and respectfully. When Saturday arrived, I chose a quiet restaurant with private booths for our meeting. I arrived early, selecting a seat with a clear view of the entrance. A small power move that Dr. Miller had suggested to establish my agency in the interaction. When my parents walked in, the sight of them momentarily took my breath away. They looked smaller, somehow more vulnerable than I remembered. My father's confident stride, replaced by a hesitant shuffle. My mother's perfect posture, slightly stooped with tension. They spotted me and approached, uncertainty evident in their expressions. No one seemed to know the appropriate greeting for this unprecedented situation, so we settled for awkward nods as they took their seats across from me. Thank you for agreeing to meet with us, Roland. My father began, his businessman's voice, failing to mask his discomfort. What happened at my birthday dinner was concerning to us. I waited, determined not to fill the silence with apologies or explanations, as I had done so many times before. We have been doing a lot of thinking, my mother continued. When it became clear I was not going to speak first, and talking. More honest talking than we have done, in years actually. That is good, I said neutrally. Roland. My father leaned forward, his hands clasped on the table. I want to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest. Have we really been as absent from your life as you suggested? I took a deep breath, centering myself. Yes, and probably more than I even expressed that night. My mother's eyes filled with tears, but she blinked them back, maintaining eye contact with me. We thought we were giving you space to be independent. You always seemed so self-sufficient, even as a child. There is a difference between respecting someone's independence and being completely uninvolved in their life, I replied, keeping my voice steady. When was the last time either of you asked me a specific question about my work, or remembered something important I told you about my life, or offered help, without me having to explicitly ask for it the way you do constantly for Allison? They exchanged glances, clearly struggling to come up with examples. We love you, Roland, my father said finally. We have always been proud of you. Love and pride are not enough if they are not expressed in ways that make the other person feel valued, I said. For years, I have felt like an afterthought in this family. The apartment flood was just the most extreme example, but it is a pattern that has existed since I was a child. My mother reached across the table as if to take my hand, then hesitated and withdrew. We had no idea you felt this way. Why did you never say anything before? I tried in 100 small ways. But after a while, it seemed pointless. And to be honest, I think part of me did not believe I deserved more attention. Children internalize the value they are shown they have. My father winced at that, a flash of genuine pain crossing his features. I never meant to make you feel less valued. I suppose I saw too much of myself in you, Roland. The quiet, responsible one who never caused problems. I assumed you were fine because I had always told myself I was fine growing up in similar circumstances. It was the first time my father had ever shared anything about his own childhood, and it caught me off guard. What do you mean? He sighed heavily, running a hand through his thinning hair. My younger brother was always the star of the family. Athletic, outgoing, needed constant attention. I was the steady, reliable one, who everyone assumed would be fine without much fuss. And I convinced myself I was fine with that arrangement. I buried myself in work, in achievement, in proving my worth through success. I saw myself in his description with startling clarity, the generational pattern of emotional neglect unfolding before me, like an architectural blueprint revealing a fundamental structural flaw. "But you were not fine with it," I said quietly. "Were you?" "No," he admitted, his voice rough with emotion. "I was not." And somehow, without even realizing it, I recreated the same dynamic with my own children. I saw your self-sufficiency as strength, rather than necessity. And I focused my attention on the squeaky wheel. My mother was openly crying now, quiet tears tracking down her carefully made-up face. "I had no idea, Thomas. You never told me about feeling that way in your family." "I never told anyone," he replied. "Until now." The conversation that followed was the most honest exchange we had ever had as a family. I articulated years of hurt and disappointment, not as accusations, but as my lived experience. They listened without defensiveness, occasionally asking clarifying questions, but never attempting to invalidate my feelings. In turn, they shared their own blind spots and the unconscious patterns they had fallen into, my father's especially, illuminating the intergenerational nature of our family dynamic. "We cannot change the past," my mother said, eventually reaching for a napkin to dab at her eyes. "But we want to do better, moving forward, Roland, if you will give us that chance." "I am moving to Seattle," I said, watching their expressions carefully as I delivered the news. "The firm has offered me a position leading their new sustainable design division there." Their surprise was evident, but what interested me more was their immediate reaction after the initial shock. "That sounds like an incredible opportunity," my father said, genuine interest in his voice, for perhaps the first time when discussing my career. "Tell us more about it." That simple request to hear about something important in my life felt monumental. For the next 20 minutes, I explained the position, the projects I would be overseeing, and my excitement about working with a team that shared my vision for environmentally conscious urban development. They asked thoughtful questions and expressed authentic pride, not the perfunctory acknowledgement I was accustomed to receiving. As our meal concluded, we established concrete expectations for our relationship moving forward. They would visit Seattle within the first 3 months of my relocation. We would have scheduled video calls that would include specific questions about each other's lives, not just superficial updates. And most importantly, they would work with a family therapist to continue addressing the patterns that had damaged our relationship. "This will not be fixed overnight," I cautioned as we prepared to leave. "Trust takes time to rebuild." "We understand," my father nodded, a new humility in his demeanor. "We are committed to doing the work, however long it takes." As we stood outside the restaurant, my mother hesitated before asking, "May I hug you, Roland?" The question itself, the respect for my boundaries it implied, moved me more than I expected. I nodded, and for the first time in years allowed myself to be held by my mother, not as a perfunctory greeting or farewell, but as a genuine expression of love and regret. The road ahead would not be easy. Decades of patterns would not be unraveled in a single conversation. But as I watched them walk toward their car, my parents holding hands in a way I had not seen since childhood, I felt the first fragile seedling of hope taking root in the scorched earth of our relationship. 6 months after that pivotal conversation, I stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of my Seattle apartment, watching the misty rain create patterns on the glass. The space was smaller than my Boston apartment had been, but it was entirely mine, decorated thoughtfully, with items chosen to reflect my aesthetic and experiences. A reclaimed wood coffee table from a local artisan, framed architectural sketches from my university days, and, most significantly, 3 photographs in simple black frames. One of me with my parents during their visit to Seattle 2 months earlier, one with Allison from her trip the previous month, and one with Jack and my Boston colleagues at my going-away party. The process of healing my relationship with my family had been neither linear nor simple. There had been moments of frustration and backsliding instances where old patterns threatened to reassert themselves. During my parents' first video call after our restaurant confrontation, my mother had spent 15 minutes talking about Allison's latest accomplishment before catching herself apologizing and directly asking me about my week. Small steps, but meaningful ones. Their visit to Seattle had marked a significant milestone in our evolving relationship. They had stayed in a hotel rather than assuming they would stay with me, respecting my space and independence. My father had shown genuine interest in my work, asking to visit my office and meet my colleagues. My mother had brought a small photo album she had created filled with pictures of me throughout my childhood and adolescence. A tangible acknowledgement of my place in the family narrative. I found these in boxes in the attic, she had explained, somewhat shamefaced. I realized we had the photos all along, we just had not displayed them properly. I am trying to correct that now. The family therapy they had committed to was making a difference. During one video call, my father had shared an insight from their therapist. She says I have been using Allison's dependence as a way to feel needed, while taking your independence as permission to be emotionally absent. It was never about loving one of you more than the other. It was about my own insecurities as a father. My relationship with Allison had transformed most dramatically. Freed from our unconscious competition for parental attention, we had begun to build a genuine adult friendship based on mutual respect and shared experiences. She had visited Seattle without our parents, staying in my guest room for a week, while exploring the city and the possibility of applying to graduate programs in the area. I think I have been hiding in their attention, she confessed, during a late-night conversation on my balcony. It is easier to be the favorite than to figure out who I am without their constant validation. Trust me. I understand. Dependency patterns, I had replied. And for the first time in our adult lives, we had laughed together with genuine warmth and recognition. My professional life in Seattle had flourished beyond my expectations. The sustainable design division I led had recently won a major contract to redesign a formerly industrial waterfront area into a mixed-use space combining affordable housing, community gardens, and small business incubators. My team respected my vision and expertise, and I had found mentorship opportunities with younger architects that fulfilled me in unexpected ways. But perhaps the most profound change had been in my relationship with myself. Through continued work with Dr. Miller, who had agreed to video sessions after my move, I had begun to recognize and challenge my deeply ingrained belief that I was somehow less worthy of attention and care than others. I had started practicing self-compassion, acknowledging my needs, and ensuring they were met rather than suppressed. The friendships I had cultivated in Seattle reflected this healthier self-concept. Unlike in Boston, where I had often played the supportive role in relationships mirroring my family position, my Seattle friends and I maintained a balanced exchange of emotional support and genuine interest. Jack visited every few months, our friendship deepening despite the distance. Sarah from the Boston office had taken a position with a Seattle firm after my recommendation, bringing a piece of my former life into my new one. My parents called on a predictable schedule now, Sunday evenings at 7, and the conversations had a different quality than before. They asked specific questions about my projects and remembered details from previous discussions. They shared their own lives with greater vulnerability, my father recently confiding his anxiety about retirement. My mother, her consideration of returning to teaching after years away from the classroom. The most telling change came when my apartment in Seattle experienced a minor plumbing issue, nothing compared to the Boston disaster, but annoying nonetheless. I mentioned it casually during our Sunday call, and the next day, without prompting, my mother texted to ask if the problem had been resolved and whether I needed anything. A small gesture, perhaps, but one that would have been unimaginable a year earlier. As I stood at my window watching the Seattle rain, I reflected on the strange grace that had come from being forgotten. Had my parents remembered the flood, had they shown concern during those 6 weeks of displacement, I might never have reached the breaking point necessary to disrupt our dysfunctional patterns. Sometimes being forgotten allows you to remember yourself, to reclaim your story from those who have been writing it without your consent. The sound of my phone interrupted these reflections. A text from my father. Just checking in. Mom and I were looking at flights for her birthday weekend next month. Would that timing work for another visit? I smiled, typing back an affirmative response. The road to healing was long with no guarantee of a perfect destination. But we were walking it together now. Eyes open, maps redrawn to include territories previously ignored. That evening, as I prepared for a week of important presentations, I found myself filled with a quiet confidence that had little to do with professional accomplishment. It came instead from the knowledge that I was seen, truly seen, not just by my family but by myself. I had discovered that visibility begins with self-recognition, with the courage to stand in your truth and demand that others see you clearly. In the end, the most profound lesson I learned from those 6 weeks of being forgotten was that I would never again forget myself. And that, perhaps, was worth every moment of pain along the way. Have you ever felt invisible in your own family or closest relationships? Share your experience in the comments. Sometimes knowing we are not alone in these struggles is the first step toward healing. If this story resonated with you, please like, subscribe, and share to help others who might be facing similar challenges. Thank you for listening to my journey. And remember, your story deserves to be heard, even if you have to be the first one to truly listen to it.